Hi, I'm Charlotte and I study English Literature at the University of Sheffield. During June last year, I participated in the SURE scheme, which is a research project funded by my university. My project concerned Edward Carpenter, who you can see on the slide. Edward Carpenter was a late Victorian and early modern. He wrote from about the 1870s until the 1920s. He was an activist, writer, thinker, and arguably a philosopher. I gave this presentation at the British Conference of Undergraduate Research this year, and I just thought I would share it online in case anybody else is interested. My supervisors are interested in animal studies, which is a branch of literature that concerns the status of the animal in contemporary and historical thought, as I'm sure you know. As a social activist, Carpenter campaigned around a wide number of issues, only a portion of which you can see here on the screen. As one of the first openly homosexual writers, this is him with his partner George Merrill, and a prominent socialist, these characteristics dominate the relatively small field of critical work about Carpenter. However, he also wrote a great amount of work on animal welfare, which has received less critical attention. So Sheila Rowbotham wrote the leading work on Carpenter during the 2000s, which is a biography on his life, and that itself is a great and seminal work, but it doesn't touch much on his attention to animal rights, even though they were quite an important part of his life. So he lived on a farm, which meant that he had a close relationship with nature, a close relationship with the animals, and theorising about them was a close thing to help him conceptualise his wider philosophy. As such, my role, which was given to me by Bob and John, was to search through the extensive collection of Carpenter's work stored at the Carpenter Collection at Sheffield Archives, and compile a bibliography of his animal writings that future animal studies students could use for reference. So the original plan was for there to be a PhD thesis written about Carpenter's animal work, but it was rejected on the grounds that there wasn't enough information provided in the application, so my role was to sort of flesh out that knowledge. I found it exciting to embark on a project that brought the work of a local writer into greater exposure, as Carpenter lived in Millthorpe, just outside Sheffield, and it's been nice to sort of see how his work resonates in the community, particularly with the group Friends of Edward Carpenter, who are lobbying for a permanent memorial to be put in place for Carpenter. And it's quite an interesting thing because Carpenter is very much one of the sort of early moderns who are pushing against the idea of Victoriana, and you would think that a memorial was very close to the sort of traditional sense of like great statues commemorating Victorian luminaries, but I think there are lots of great and imaginative ways that you could do such a thing that the Friends of Edward Carpenter are trying to achieve, so I recommend checking out their website. Working at Sheffield Archives was really interesting, both in terms of learning about how archives work and in terms of seeing what kind of documentation there was at the Carpenter Collection. So the Carpenter Collection contains a number of different kinds of historical documents relevant to Carpenter. So most obviously Carpenter's collection of books. There were also newspaper clippings, some of which it was a bit ambiguous about whether or not they were actually sort of cut out by Carpenter or whether they were included in the collection by someone else who thought they were relevant to Carpenter. But either way, they're really interesting historical and contextual documents. There were also many letters. There were letters between Carpenter and famous figures of the day. There were letters between family members of Carpenter, between his friends and also his fans, all of which were very interesting. There were pamphlets that Carpenter wrote. Pamphlets were a sort of essay which was published in like a miniature format. With the proliferation of the printing press, they were often used to make a statement for political aims. They could be a useful medium for activists at the time. Carpenter wrote a lot of pamphlets for the Humanitarian League, which was run by Henry Stephen Salt. Henry Stephen Salt was the most prominent animal activist of the day, perhaps. He was a vegetarian, and he was the first person to conceptualise a sort of theoretical concept of animal rights, which is really interesting. And there are an interesting selection of letters between Carpenter and Salt where they talk about animals, among other things. So the letters and the newspaper clippings were kept on microfilm, which is quite literally a type of film, and it's used when material is perhaps too delicate or too important to be given out for public use. So I viewed the material projected on a microfilm reader, which is a strange piece of equipment to learn how to use. It's quite noisy, it's quite unlike anything I've used before, but it was really great to gain those skills. And Carpenter, I discovered he had a range of public and private documentation of his animal rights interests, predominantly vegetarianism. So Carpenter became a vegetarian at what was quite an early time to be a vegetarian, so somewhere in the 1870s or 1880s he became a vegetarian, although it's hard for me to tell. He himself attributed the rise of interest in vegetarianism during his lifetime to the growth of nut substitutes, the kind of things we can still see today, like nut roasts or nut cutlets. Carpenter thought vegetarianism was important, particularly because he felt that it was unhealthy for humans to consume animals because animals contained energies which weren't fit to be consumed in the human body, which could cause ill effects for their health, which is quite a strange theory, which we don't necessarily have in the same form today. I found that Carpenter's relationship with vegetarianism was quite equivocal, though. So for him, this sort of nutritional argument came above an ethical argument, I found, for not eating meat. And I also found that meant he was more inclined to dip back into meat eating wherever he preferred to. I found that was partly to do with a resistance to following any one sort of ideology for a long time. He was quite resistant to the idea of dogma, and he also campaigned against other aspects of animal cruelty which are still being remonstrated against today, so hunting and fur wearing. And I don't have much time to touch on those topics today, but if you're interested, then please do ask me a question. Possibly the main area of animal activism that Carpenter was concerned with was the anti-vivisection movement. Vivisection was the dissection of animals for scientific study, although the term is perhaps out of date now. Dissection is perhaps preferred. This tied into Carpenter's general dislike for the progression of Victorian science. No offence to any scientists watching, but Carpenter's work provides an interestingly early precursor to that of Thomas Kuhn, who suggested in the 1960s that science operates as a paradigm, which is a set of belief systems rather than objective truths. Likewise, Carpenter suggests that science views the world from a quite limited perspective, investigating individual phenomena at the expense of a wide, holistic understanding of the universe, which perhaps is more in tune with philosophy. For Carpenter, vivisection provided a prime example of this closed-minded science. Not only were animals quite literally dissected, torn apart, but the vivisector's decision to pursue animal cruelty was closed-minded and inevitably blinded them to humanity's essential similarity to and kinship with animal life. And you can sort of see this sort of image of blindness being left in the dark in the actual contemporary practice of vivisection. Vivisection at the time was predominantly the hobby of middle-class sort of doctors who would vivisect in dark and hidden laboratories in their own homes. So that led to quite a lot of imagery of the darkness of this amoral animal cruelty compared to the enlightenment of an understanding of unity with the animals. So for Carpenter, this kinship between humans and animals manifested in the similarities between humans and animals, in the way that animals, especially the higher animals, inverted commas, such as dogs or horses, were possessed of human characteristics. So for example, one of the sort of measures of closeness to humanity that Carpenter saw, which has continued throughout time, is the ability of animals to be possessed of language. And Carpenter conducted a study of the hens in his garden to try and show how their clucks represented their own unique language in quite a bizarre essay called The Language of Domestic Fowls. And he also demonstrated characteristics such as the capacity for animals to show love to humans and to other animals, and for their capacity to engage in fulfilling employment. An understanding of our unity with the animals was, for Carpenter, only one element of knowing our entire fundamental unity with the universe itself. So this also included inanimate aspects of nature, and also other humans, which was quite a radical thing that transcended racial, national, and gendered boundaries. Carpenter called the recognition of this unity cosmic consciousness, and saw it as the key to knowledge and to spiritual well-being. It's a theme that runs throughout his work. It's very important to the way that he conceptualizes the world. However, he did feel that only humans could attain this cosmic consciousness. Although he saw animals as resembling humans, they were not equals, as humans lacked self-consciousness to begin with. And self-consciousness was a necessary step towards cosmic consciousness, so the animals could not, at least for now, in the evolutionary process, attain that cosmic consciousness. So humans need to use not only the cosmic consciousness that they supposedly will eventually gain, but also the self-consciousness that they possess at this point in evolution to protect the animals, like Adam in the Garden of Eden. So animal studies today might object to this. They might attempt to question such a human-centered, paternalistic vision of human-animal relations. And I've tried to use this image of concentric circles that you can see on the screen, circles within circles, to show how Carpenter saw humans as located at the centre of understanding, but also how he felt that this understanding must reach beyond the self into a cosmic consciousness that encompasses first the higher, then the lower animals, then nature and the universe itself. So it's a sort of dual contingency where you can see how knowledge is expanding outwards from the human, but this knowledge is also coming back inwards into a more consolidated spiritual understanding within the self. So if you pause for a moment here on this screen, you can see the only time in Carpenter's work that he ever explicitly mentions the image of concentric circles in his writings on cosmic consciousness. But Carpenter, I think, thinks about plenty of the great number of issues he explores in his work in a way that's easy to map onto this diagram of concentric circles. So he often picks a sort of central concept and then suggests that other separate but ultimately united related concepts expand, gradiate outwards beyond it. So I didn't have time to talk about this in my presentation, but I'd just like to comment on the example of nationalism. So Carpenter has an essay called Nationalism and Internationalism, where he argues quite strangely that compared to some of the left activists at the time who were rejecting the sort of imperialistic idea of nationalism, that instead we should embrace nationalism because it offers people who aren't these sort of middle-class leftists with the mobility to explore the world, both through travel and reading. Nationalism offers the lower classes an opportunity to experience unity on a national basis, and this unity must necessarily expand outwards into an international consciousness, which then must expand into a universal consciousness, coming back to that idea of cosmic consciousness. So it's not often that you would find somebody who was prepared to reconcile internationalism with nationalism, let alone see nationalism as a step towards internationalism. But I think that's another example of how you can map his ideas onto this image of concentric circles, if that makes sense. My latest research for my undergraduate dissertation traces where and how this imagery of concentric circles can be applied across Carpenter's work, beyond his animal writings. I also explore why Carpenter would choose to organise his ideas in this way. So this was kind of inspired by my construction of my bibliography of Carpenter's animal rights work for the Shaw scheme. I found it very hard to organise his different animal writings under subheadings alone. This is because his works frequently overlap in subject matter, and often understanding one aspect of Carpenter's work requires an understanding of another. So, for example, there's a dense link in his work between animal rights, his dislike of science, and also his interest in Indian spirituality. So I found, as I've demonstrated on this slide, that it was more appropriate to organise the bibliography using the concentric circles image as well as specific subheadings. So by balancing the two things, I wanted to show both the unity and the hierarchy which is present in Carpenter's understanding, in the same way that his ideas about animals are organised by a hierarchical conception of human and animal relations, but one that's also informed by this idea that was radical at the time, about the unity between the two groups. So in my dissertation, I'm going to sort of argue that concentric circles provide this really suitable interpretive tool for talking about Carpenter, because they do manage to capture this sort of balance between unity and hierarchy. And sadly, I have to digress now, but I'm kind of exploring the idea that this complex intertwining of ideas was a conscious strategy of Carpenter's. So the way that he tied his works together in such a complex way helped to reinforce his general philosophy about the fundamental unity of all things, not enabling his work to be atomized in the same way that science is atomized in its sort of empirical dissecting form. And I also think that it's a strategy of Carpenter's to try and show the interconnection between all the social issues he so ardently wrote about. So, for example, Carpenter's interested in proving to the socialist community, the wider socialist community, that animal rights are an important and interrelated issue with socialism. He wrote in an Italian socialist newspaper about that very topic. This is also something that's being done by Henry Stephen Salt, who, if you can remember, ran the Humanitarian League, because the left at the time, as it is now, was a very broad church of campaigners who all had different political affiliations. Carpenter sort of saw himself as this older figure on the left coming out of Victorian times. He sort of saw himself as an overseer of the left, and also as a general seer, in the sense that he had this sense of his own attunement with spiritual understanding. So I think he wanted to avoid, like I said earlier, dogma. He wanted to avoid being committed to any one thing, and instead he wanted to carry on reconciling everything back into this sense of unity, everything back into this idea that everything, no matter how disparate it seems, constitutes a sort of unified gradation towards a cosmic consciousness that will come inevitably. So it's a positive theory, and I suppose there needs to be a unified way of conceptualizing that. I think it's important because it brings Carpenter's legacy a new form of light. I think that despite Carpenter's resistance of any one affiliation, despite Carpenter's resistance of any one identity, he has kind of been pigeonholed as this hippie, vegetarian sort of mystic. I don't think Carpenter would like that image. I think he would want us to see how his work is more encompassing of a wide range of ideas. So that's something that I want to help achieve with my dissertation work. I hope that made sense, and if it didn't, then feel free to shoot me any questions you may have, and thank you for listening.